Well, hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar. So glad you could be with us on this chilly Thursday afternoon for an inside look at environmental engineering. We are so very excited for you to meet our panel. We're also excited to get to know them, get to know their day-to-day, and hopefully inspire all of you as you head towards maybe an exciting career in this field. My name is Joe McFarland. I'm the Media Relations and Communications Specialist at the Schulich School of Engineering, and it is my pleasure and an honor to be the MC slash moderator for today's session. Not only will I be asking questions of the panelists over the next little while here, but we'll also be taking some time to answer your questions as well. So feel free to ask away on the Zoom webinar Q&A function. We will be getting to those at the end of this session. Before we get started here today, we'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Treaty 7 region here in southern Alberta. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. We'll start things off this afternoon by welcoming the director for the Centre for Environmental Engineering Research and Education. He's a professor in the Department of Mechanical and Manufacturing Engineering, and his research ranges from renewable energy and solar and thermal resources and energy engineering to energy conversion and storage. We'd like to welcome Dr. Abdul Majid Mohammed to say a few words. Dr. Mohammed, take it away.
Hi, everyone. It is, in fact, my pleasure to be here and give you some information about CERI, which stands for Center Environmental Engineering Research and Education. Under CERI, there are two programs. One of them is undergraduate, which is Energy and Environment minor. Regardless which discipline you are, for example, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, civil engineering, you can take few courses and get minor in environmental engineering. And this is, in fact, adds value for your career. And also most companies, they have a section or department, environmental engineering, and any project cannot pass unless that department will approve it. It is very, very important for all engineering to be familiar with environmental aspects of their work. Another program we have, which is graduate level program, Master in Environmental Engineering, which consists of 10 courses. Students take 10 courses within 2 or 6 years period. It is very, very flexible program because some students working in the company and they cannot take 5, 6 courses or 4 courses per semester. Usually take 1 or 2 courses until then you can finish it within the period. It is very, very flexible program. And that's kind of the things, again, it is adds value for your knowledge. And some companies, in fact, encourage their employee to enroll in such a program and even support them financially. Also, if you are a professional engineer also encourage, in fact, as ACT asks for all the professional members to take some courses to enhance their knowledge, and that's kind of the things. Yeah, I encourage you to join our program. Thank you. I am open for any question.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Dr. Mohammed. As I mentioned before, you can go to the chat function, the Q&A function, and we'll get to that a little bit later on. Now is about the time where we introduce you to our panelists. First off, she's an associate professor in the Department of Chemical and Petroleum Engineering, Canada Research Chair in Energy Technology in this Technology Assessment, and was recently in the news for her research into how well open source data estimates greenhouse gas emissions from oil sands. Dr. Joule Bergerson is going to be joining us here in just a moment. Also joining us, he's a professor in the Department of Mechanical and Manufacturing Engineering, known for his involvement in renewable energy projects across the globe. He's worked on small projects to supply and regulate power for remote communities in Australia, Brazil, Burkina Faso, Canada, and Ethiopia. Dr. David Wood is here. And from the private sector, 2006 graduate of our program in mechanical engineering, project manager for Solus Energy Consulting. His company provides consulting services for renewable energy solutions such as wind power, solar power, run-of-river hydro, and biomass. Keith Knudsen is here. So there are our three panelists, and I've got a series of questions, and For the most part, this is going to be kind of an open floor discussion, but I'm going to kind of lead the way through it and ask pointed questions of each of the panelists. And then we may end up riffing throughout the process as well. So we're going to start things off here, asking a pretty generic question. I want to start off with Joule. When did you first realize that you wanted to become involved in environmental engineering?
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, it was a bit of a circuitous route to get to my work in this space. So I started out heading towards medicine, and I thought that was the direction I wanted to take. Started out in undergrad and doing chemistry with environmental science because I always, when I look back, my high school projects and things like that, I always seem to focus on environmental issues. And as I got into university, I sort of realized that I wanted to focus on protecting the environment and helping generations into the future, as opposed to medicine, which was sort of helping people immediately in the moment. Glad that we have people doing that, but I felt like, thinking about the future prospects and having long-term impact, environmental focus seemed to come to me around that time throughout my undergrad. And then the shift from science to engineering was that I got really excited about some of the applied projects I was working on. And this idea of problem solving and real world problems that industry faces and society faces today sort of came together. So the environmental push came first, and then the need for the engineering skills to actually tackle some of these problems came later. And so I actually did an MEng in environmental engineering to help me transition from science into engineering, but definitely not a straight path.
Absolutely. And it's interesting how many people actually go down that path. They completely switch gears midway through realizing what they really love. David, was that the case for you? What's your background?
No, my case was a little bit different, Joe. I always wanted to do engineering, but I'm old enough that when I went to university, there was no environmental engineering. So I did one of the traditional disciplines, mechanical engineering, and I was looking for ways in which I could use mechanical engineering for good purposes. Because I think, engineers like to build things and they like to do things, they like to be active, but, some of the things that we do have harmful consequences. And I was looking around for ways of doing things that had better consequences. And you might be able to tell from my accent that I came from Australia. And Australia, like Canada, is a very sparsely populated country. And so I ended up getting interested in issues of how you provide power for remote communities or remote mine sites or telecommunications facilities and things like that. Because in many countries like Australia and Canada, you're just not going to be able to extend the power network to cover, a small place a long way away. So I got involved with that, and I got involved with development of small wind turbines and small hydropower turbines and things like that. And about the time I came to Calgary about 10 years ago, I started to think more about the global consequences of what we're doing, because we have environmental problems in the Western world, which we all know about and we're trying to act on. But the thought came to me, what happened, or what would happen if everyone in the world had the same standard of living as us on the panel, and probably many of the people listening to us? The environmental consequences of that would be huge. So I got involved in renewable energy projects, again with a remote community focus in places like Nepal and Burkina Faso and Ethiopia and places like that. And that hasn't been a large chunk of what I do, but it's been a very significant chunk of what I want to do. And it's one of the things that makes me really excited about what I do.
Sounds like you're pretty inspired by it, and I want to get to that in a second as well. But I want to switch over to Keith for a second and talk about your background as well. Keith, how did you get involved in this? Because we've seen both sides of the spectrum. Do you fall somewhere in the middle, maybe?
Yeah, it's funny. When I was a child, I remember my 5th grade science fair project was on wind power, and so I think back then I kind of sort of knew that's the direction that I wanted to head in, and who would have thought, 40 years later, 30 years later, I'd actually be in wind power. So yeah, I was very interested in environmental sorts of things when I was a kid. And I think I've always been interested in science and engineering seemed to be such a great fit just for the doors that it opens for people. And so when I was in my undergrad, I saw that the University of Calgary had a program of a master's degree with a specialization in environmental engineering. And I was really interested in, at that point, looking at sort of how to increase the overall efficiency of power plants. That was sort of what I really wanted to kind of get into. And I've always been interested in electricity, I guess. And so I did my thesis on energy efficiency on power plants, and I thought, okay, that's going to be where I'm headed. And then I thought, okay, well, instead of just helping increase the efficiency and decarbonizing the power sector, how about we just go to completely carbon free and go with renewable energy? So that kind of kicked off that trajectory into renewable energy. So I've been doing that since 2007. All across Canada, and now Alberta seems to be the hotbed for renewable energy. So it's really exciting to sort of see everything kind of happening in my backyard here in Alberta.
Fantastic to hear. We talked a little bit about inspiration and that day to day, what gets your motor running. And we'll start with David here on this one. What is it that kind of gets you up in the morning? What is it that kind of fascinates you day to day in what you do?
I think I have an automatic alarm clock. I wake up virtually the same time any day, no matter what time I get to sleep. What I like to do when I get up is usually something along the lines of working on one of my student projects. I've been incredibly fortunate in my time at Calgary that I've been involved in a whole range of projects. My original background is actually wind energy. I'm an aerodynamicist by training, and I design wind turbine blades and things like that. But I also do some of the projects that I was telling you about earlier. And also I have a wide range of student projects. So, often what I do first thing in the morning, which is when my energy levels are the highest, I think I'm a morning person, is to get stuck into a report or a paper that we're writing, or something that my students have raised that comes to me straight then, and that's a really good time to think about it. So, yeah.
Keith, how about you?
I'd say, one of the things that's really exciting and that I've seen over my career is, when I first started, there was a lot of talk about, subsidies in the renewable energy industry, and that it's not viable and it was expensive, and I think one of the most amazing thing that's happened recently is the cost of both wind and solar have come down so much that it's really the most competitive cost of electricity. And so what gets me excited when I wake up in the morning is the fact that we're no longer talking about an industry that's just getting subsidies. We're talking about a viable business here that's competitive, and people are building projects to build businesses, and that's really exciting for me to be able to contribute to the the growth of the renewable energy industry in terms of it being a viable business.
And we'll finish things off with Joule. What gets you up in the morning and has you excited to get the workday going?
Yeah, so I'm not a morning person. So I drink a lot of coffee in the mornings and listen to CBC. And that's part of what gets me excited about things is just the finding problems that society is facing that you can contribute to. And there's no end of discussion about energy issues. And I do energy systems analysis. So I look at the renewables and the role that they can play in our energy system, but also in our fossil-based system that we have today. And how do we think about transitioning that, reducing impacts associated with it, and things like that. And so very much, in discussion in society and thinking about that and ways that I can contribute to that is really the exciting part of environmental engineering, because it really is dealing with problems we're looking at as a society.
Absolutely. Just a quick reminder as well that you can ask your own questions here. If you've got something that you'd like to ask all of the panelists, or maybe just one, by all means, we do have the Q&A function here on Zoom that we can ask a little bit later on in the program. Let's get back to some of the questions that I had, and we'll start with Keith on this one, because he's one that's now in the private sector. And one of the the fascinating aspects as I've become introduced to to the world of Schulich is the relationships between not just students and professors and faculty members, but also with the private sector. And how important was it in the course of your career or over the course of your career to continue to not just manufacture those relationships across the spectrum, but also to curate them and to kind of keep everybody in tune with what's going on?
That's a great question. I mean, there's so many things in industry that are relationship based. You know, if it's just consulting with the public on power plant projects, if it's working with your team to move projects forward, working with regulators to understand how they're going to evaluate your project and have that move forward. So I think relationships are so important, and being able to build those relationships is incredibly important. One of the relationships I actually did want to touch on a little bit that has been the most rewarding for me in my career has been some of the projects that I've worked with First Nations people. And I've worked with people in BC and Alberta and Manitoba, and I find the cultural experience that I've had working with those with First Nations groups has been so incredible, and a really it's been a big benefit for my personal growth and my professional growth. But I think starting from when I was in university, getting those relationships with people in industry, regardless of where you're from or where they're from, being able to get mentors or be a mentor. That's something that I was able to get a mentor when I was at the University of Calgary, and that really helped launch my career into where it is now. And so I can't say more about relationships. They're the fundamental of everything that we do, right? So yeah.
Absolutely. Joule, from your perspective, when you're speaking with students, when you're speaking with staff, how integral is that, especially in this world of trying to fix, as you've coined a couple of times here, is trying to solve the riddles of the world?
Yeah, so I would say that my favorite part about my job is working with the students. I think because these are sort of wicked societal problems, we need fresh ideas. We need people to push us, and we need to continually be keeping up to date and moving forward and pushing the envelope. And students really help to do that, and providing them a space by which they can actually grow their own thoughts and skills is the most exciting part of my job. But given that we try to work on real world problems, we also do need to work with industry. And so connecting student experiences with, actually going out to sites and seeing what the problems actually are, and then coming up with solutions that can be valuable is really fun to see as part of this.
And in all your travels, David, I assume you've come up with a relationship or two that you've been able to curate, and really, I assume, has kind of allowed you almost to do as much traveling as you have done to be able to do all these projects.
In many ways, that's true. I think the one of the ways I look at a question like this is, what do you need to get a project done? And when you get involved with these projects, you just realize what a huge range of skills that you need. You need mechanical engineers, you need environmental engineers, you need electrical engineers, etc., etc. And then you need some way for which that technical interface, that technical and professional engineering information and skill set interfaces with the community. Does the community want this project? Is it appropriate for what they want? Are you making good choices, or how can you engage them in maximizing the benefit from the program, from the project? So that side of it I really like. I also, like Joule, really enjoy the interaction with students working on usually very technically related parts of projects, and just the question of, I have students from countries all around the world. They have different personalities, they have different skill sets, they have different academic backgrounds. How can you maximize the output of your project with those various skill sets? So, I think that's actually something I think about most days. How do we make the best out of what we have?
And the reason I ask that question is because I think one of the challenges, and I was a student way back when, and that was one thing that kind of took me by surprise, is just how small the world can be, which segues into the next question is, what took you by surprise as you went into the workforce? Because when you go into post-secondary education, you kind of have this mindset of, this is what I want to do. And then all of a sudden your career kind of goes off the beaten path kind of thing. So Joel, we'll start with you. What's kind of taken you by surprise over the course of your career since you began in post-secondary?
Yeah, so definitely it was a surprise at a few different stages of my career. I'd say, as I said, I went into the MEng program to actually shift from chemistry into chemical engineering and environmental engineering. But I went in with the eyes to wanting to go out into industry and do work in industry. And had the plan of Pynchon Environmental was my target consulting company that I was going to work at, and saw the future of what I could do in that space. And I think that would have been a great tract as well, but I sort of got caught by the research itself. And both in terms of loving doing the research and really liking the day-to-day of a research career, but also this potential to work with students. And then the other piece is that I hadn't had the idea that doing the post-secondary education as well as going into academia, that you could have as much of an impact as you can. And so the things that we're doing are sort of affecting policy and helping companies think through their strategy to net zero, for example. And so that was really surprising to me. I never thought I would end up in academia, let alone do the PhD after the MEng. So lots of surprises along the way.
I kind of like surprises. It keeps you on your toes, right? David, how about you?
I think well, I was going to answer it along the lines of my previous answer. I think what really has surprised me, and it continually surprises me, is what a wide range of skills we need to deal with the issues that we are facing, environmental, etc., etc. I somehow thought that having graduated into a fairly narrow box called mechanical engineering, I could be let loose on the world and I would be able to make a big difference. And, I am good at doing things like designing wind turbine blades, but then I find I need structural engineers to tell me how to design the structure of the blades. I need a dynamics person to analyze the dynamics of the blades. I need an electrical engineer to design the generator. I need power electronics people and control system engineers to do the rest. And, you don't actually achieve a good engineering outcome unless all those disciplines work together. I have a really good article that I give to students very often, that a story of designing a 80-meter long wind turbine blade, and just showing exactly what I'm saying, how you have to interact with those disciplines. And I think I came out of mechanical engineering. I did a master's degree in mechanical engineering and a PhD in aerodynamics. I sort of kept that funneled or tunnel vision throughout my learning experience. And I think looking at something like the environmental engineering master's program, I think one of the great benefits of that program is that it does give you a perspective that's much wider than, say, the perspective of your narrow background degree. So that just keeps hitting me in the head that we do need that range of skills.
Mm. Keith, I'm curious from your standpoint as somebody who's in the industry now, anything take you by surprise in terms of that transition from student life to the business life?
Yeah, and I don't want to steal David's answer, but yeah, he's bang on. I think I sort of underestimated how complicated projects are and what breadth of talent you need, not only on the engineering side, but finance and legal and biologists and all that kind of stuff. So that took me by surprise a little bit. I thought I'd be out there monitoring air quality and that would kind of be my job, but you're interacting with so many other disciplines. The other thing that surprised me, and this is sort of more of a recent thing, is is how fast companies are deciding to go net zero and to decarbonize. I think there's a lot of pressure internationally and nationally for companies to have sustainability targets. And I think in the past we saw, the Starbucks of the world would have their sustainability report, but it was just kind of, maybe lip service. But I'm finding now that everyone, if you're not talking about it, you're being left behind. And that kind of took me by surprise. I think it's happening faster than we maybe anticipated. And it was a nice surprise anyway.
Some pretty nice surprises across the board. I'm curious, moving on to the next kind of set of questions here, is give us an idea of some of the challenges maybe on the day-to-day that you face, some of the things that the hurdles that you have to face here. And we'll start with David on this one.
I think a lot of the hurdles that we face are getting the pieces of the jigsaw together. I tend to work with projects more at the conception and initial implementation phase rather than the completion and the commissioning and handing over. I'll give you an example where we are involved with the Arctic Institute of North America. That's housed at the University of Calgary. And they have a research station in the Yukon. It's about halfway between Whitehorse and the Alaska border. It's a beautiful place. And they have just purchased a hydroponic food growing system. So a company delivered a trailer to the research institute with a hydroponic system in it and a big solar photovoltaic system to power that hydroponic system. That happened last summer. And so far the system has worked reasonably well, but you get a problem. The station is not in the Arctic Circle, but there's about 4 weeks a year where the sun is either behind the mountains or just level with the mountains. So photovoltaics is not going to give you the power, and a 50 kilowatt system gives you an indication of how much power they actually need to grow the food. And I think, the need for fresh food in the north, particularly in winter, is a pretty obvious one. And to truck it up from southern Alberta or California or Mexico is incredibly expensive. How do you go about providing that extra power? And so we've looked at a range of things to do. It's not a place where hydropower is going to be useful. There is wind there, but it's not as windy as many parts in Arctic Canada are. So what do you actually do? So we've been looking at various options for providing, if you like, backup power during the winter time. I mean, we could take the easy way out and rely on diesel, but as Keith said, in this modern world, the environmental consequences of your decisions are getting more and more important. So that's the sort of thing that I often get involved with.
Keith, over to you on this one. What are some of the bigger challenges you face on a day-to-day basis?
Well, maybe not on a day-to-day basis, but one of the biggest challenges that I face is actually in the public consultation realm. I do a lot of open houses and meeting with landowners and that kind of thing. And especially in Alberta, it's tricky because especially where wind and solar projects go in Alberta is typically oil and gas country, and there's a bit of us versus them. And I think there's a message that I wish somebody would grab onto, which is the fact that in Alberta we're good at energy, and we're going to need fossil fuels for the foreseeable future, but we are transitioning, and we have such a great resource of people in this province, and we have such great engineering schools in this province, and I think that message of we can do oil, gas, sun, and wind, and let's do it all, and let's be expert at all of it, and so that's kind of one of the messages that I like to try and get out there. It seems to resonate well because I don't like the us versus them, you know, and it's a big challenge that we kind of face in the renewables industry, you know, and so it's not necessarily day to day, but it is kind of one of the biggest challenges.
I don't know if you've been reading the headlines. I'm pretty sure anybody can say that that's probably one of the bigger challenges. I've always been a big believer that we can do and it doesn't necessarily have to be or all the time. And so hopefully this is kind of one of those conversations. And I know that there are some people that are watching and listening here that are thinking maybe that they are going to transition from the traditional oil and gas to maybe something that's more renewable. And Joule, I know you've been, as I mentioned off the top, that your involvement in measuring emissions and you're obviously very involved in the traditional oil and gas, but and the knowledge of it. How much of that is a challenge for you in terms of trying to turn the tide, so to speak, and get people to be more knowledgeable about what's going on here in this province?
Yeah, I'd say that one of the biggest challenges that we face is that these are complex issues, right? And when it comes to the environmental impacts associated with these, it oftentimes comes down to trade-offs, right? So the cost of energy versus the greenhouse gas emissions versus other forms of impacts to land, water, air. And so that's a complex thing to wrap your head around as a researcher, let alone a citizen of Alberta that's, you know, trying to make decisions for themselves. And so, you know, thinking about how do we actually weigh those trade-offs and present the trade-offs to people that have to make decisions, not with academic speak, but actually with, you know, communication that actually hits the right level in terms of explaining this without getting into all the complexity, but having people appreciate that these are not easy decisions, that they're highly complex, and they often have trade-offs embedded in them. And so I find that you know, some of the challenges go beyond my skill set, but with collaborating with folks in communications, as well as you know, stakeholder engagement and other aspects, you know, folks on campus that do some of the research in that space, that we can help to make the results of our work more relevant to folks. And then I think the other piece is this, you know, oftentimes the dialogue is, you know, all renewables tomorrow or oil and gas as it is today forever, and somehow getting closer to the middle where we actually make use of all the advances and the lower costs of renewables as quickly as we possibly can, as well as you know, improving the performance of the existing system and leveraging that to look for hybrid solutions is what I always try to pose to my students is how can we make use of the infrastructure, the knowledge, the technologies that we have today, and use that to jumpstart the transition and to help facilitate the integration of things like renewables. So I see that, you know, bridging that dialogue, but also thinking about it from an engineering perspective of how do we design solutions that help us, you know, bridge that.
Certainly a lot to take in so far. If you've got questions for our panelists, again, a quick reminder that we do have the Q&A function here on this Zoom session. There has been a question already, so you don't have to line up. You don't have to stand in front of a microphone like you normally would for a session like this. All you got to do is have a keyboard handy. So we will get to those questions. I know, like I said, there's one already, plenty more, I'm sure, to come. My next question and round of questions actually goes back to those students that we were talking about earlier. There might be some or prospective students out there who might be watching, listening right now, who are sitting there going, what are my prospects for a job? What's the atmosphere, the energy like, so to speak, in the job market right now? And I want to start with Keith, because you're front and center in this right now. What is sort of what's the buzz on the street around the industry right now?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's sort of two things. One of the things is really talking about decarbonization and what that means for anybody who's an emitter of carbon. And I think there's so many interesting challenges for engineers specifically in that. Because if you're an industrial facility, you're going to be generating GHG emissions. If you're a cement plant, if you're a power plant, if you're an oil and gas facility, and I think there's going to be a lot of attention on how do we make those processes more efficient. It's going to be, you know, a gradual thing as we start moving towards net zero. But I think there's a lot of opportunity for engineers specifically to get into those types of facilities and implement creative solutions to help increase overall efficiency. And I think that's sort of across the board for you know, any type of engineer that could get into sort of the decarbonization world. The other side of it is, you know, the industry that I'm in, which is renewable energy, and we see a lot of transition, especially in Alberta, away from coal and other fossil fuel-based generation into renewable energy. And you know, there's a lot of need for technical people in the industry in terms of actual design of the components, you know, manufacturing the components, operating things, troubleshooting when things go wrong, and yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity for engineers in both decarbonization and renewable electricity generation, especially in Alberta.
Joule, you're the one that gets to speak, or one of two that get to speak on a day-to-day basis with students. What are you telling them now, and what are you telling those who might be watching, listening right now, thinking about the possibility of maybe changing career paths down the line?
Yeah, so I think that things have changed in the Calgary context in terms of the oil and gas industry downsizing and less jobs immediately available. But what I see is that there's still quite a bit of emphasis in terms of reducing environmental impacts generally in the oil and gas industry, as well as other industries coming in. And the investment in renewables, for example, in this province, means that there's some really exciting things going on in this space as well. And historically, the students that I've worked with have done quite well in a job market, even during the downturn, because companies are always looking for engineers. So that solid technical base is always really important. But if you can also think from sort of that systems perspective, and you can think across different environmental impacts and help to assess those, that's a really valuable skill that I think is still relatively unique in terms of training programs out there. And so I see that they do have a strategic advantage, both in the traditional oil and gas companies, but also in some of these new startups and new activities that are going on in the province.
I want to expand on that just a little bit with you, Joule, for a second. And it's about that idea of being forward thinking to a certain extent. It's not necessarily about thinking about what has happened over the last 10 years and not necessarily about thinking what's going to happen over the next couple of years, for example, because governments come and go, et cetera, et cetera. But how important is it in your eyes when you're passing along those messages to students that they should be kind of thinking bigger picture, and they should be thinking about how some of the skills that they get from one aspect of this can be used in a variety of different ways?
Yeah, I think it's really important, and hopefully the students are embracing this idea that they have to think differently, and then the workforce is going to be looking for them to contribute these ideas of how to think about this differently. It's a fresh perspective and new ideas, and so I think that's it feels daunting going into this workforce right now, but if you can bring that and have that attitude as well as the skills that allow you to contribute those kind of ideas, I think most companies are looking for that. We see oil and gas companies that are pledging to be carbon neutral by 2050. It's not clear that all of them have the full strategic plan of how to arrive at that, right? So they will be looking anywhere they can to find those kind of ideas. So if you can come in with that sort of, mindset of contributing those kind of ideas, you'll be very competitive, I would say, in terms of applying for these jobs.
David, there's been quite a bit of focus on the energy industry, but you mentioned it in the last answer, a couple of answers ago, in terms of it's not just energy here either. There's so many different ways of going about it with what you get from here. Talk a little bit more about what you're telling students about how those skills can be used in a variety of ways.
Yeah, that's a good question, because that goes back to that broad spectrum idea of what's required. What we're seeing with job postings in places like LinkedIn is that the number of jobs that have words like sustainability or environmental in the job title or the job description is just rising substantially. And I think it's because of what Joule and Keith have said about how even traditional engineering companies are now realizing that part of the social license to operate is to be much more environmentally responsible. And so that's very much what we're seeing. I mean, I can also talk about particular students. Of course, I can't name them, but as an example, I was involved with a master's student a couple of years ago who came from the oil and gas industry and wanted to retrain. She's now working for the biggest photovoltaics installer in Calgary. I have another ex-student of mine who now manages TransAlta's wind turbine fleet in the US. So there are specific examples that you can give, and the general impression that I'm getting by when we track job vacancies is that it is expanding substantially.
Keith, I wanted to ask about skill sets. Joule mentioned something about how it's about attitude for a lot of it, but also the skill sets. And as you've gone about it, what kinds of skills did you get from University of Calgary, from Schulich, that you're able to use on a day-to-day basis out there in the real world?
Yeah, I think one of the things that Joule mentioned was sort of having a perspective of, the systems of how things intertie with each other. And I think, as an engineer and being, educated in at the U of C, having that perspective on, how do you connect things to each other. And my background is mechanical engineering, so I'm more, how do rotating things connect with each other. But I think like that skill set of being able to sort of, look at the problem and see it as an opportunity, and how do you get all the pieces that fit together into finding that solution to that problem. And in my work in the past 15 years, it's been a lot of problem solving, and I think most engineers find themselves in a role where you're trying to solve problems. And I think, the Schulich School of Engineering really sets people up to have that skill set of being able to identify not only where the problem is, but also what are the resources you need to be able to get there? Who are the people you need to talk to? What are the different types of disciplines you might need to combine to find a solution? So, I think it's sort of a combination of being able to sort of see the whole perspective and be able to identify the different components that go into that solution.
Guess I got to turn the mute off. I knew that would happen at some point, and it just waited until almost the very end. Joule, I wanted to ask you a little bit about this course-based MEng program, and tell us a little bit about this one-year idea and how this is all going to play out, especially for those who are looking to pivot their engineering careers.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a intensive program to really get you an additional skill set that you can take back to the workforce. And so the idea is that you can do it in a condensed time period. It is intense, but it is something that will refresh some of your skills that you've got from your undergraduate. Hopefully, apply some of the skills you've learned in the workforce if you've been out there for a few years, and then really get you geared up to start contributing in this additional space beyond the sort of more traditional background that you might have.
David, what excites you about this program as you look at it from over top?
I think what excites me comes from what I was saying before about the difference between having a very narrow professional education compared to a more general education that allows you to be part of big teams and to be able to relate to other disciplines in engineering. I think, in retrospect, that's something that I did miss from my education, because I just didn't realize how important it was for any branch of an engineer in any branch to be able to have an intelligent conversation with an engineer in another branch. And I think, this master's program is a very good way to broaden your skill set in order to be able to achieve those goals.
I see a couple more questions lining up. We'll get to that in a couple more minutes here. So if you got more questions, by all means, use the Q&A function, and we will certainly answer those questions in a second. My final question for our panelists here has to do with that idea of inspiration and motivation and that kind of thing. And what is the most gratifying part of what you do on a day-to-day basis? And we're going to start things off with Joule this time around.
Great. Yeah, so I think I still have that environment piece at the core of what I do, and so being able to feel like you've made an impact in terms of improving our environment for future generations. Sometimes that's harder to see than others. If you've affected the policy development in a certain area or something like that, it's not directly obvious. But really, that's the kind of thing that is exciting. The other part is to see students come through programs like this this and go out and succeed. So I keep in touch with a lot of the students that I've worked with and follow where they're going and all the exciting things they're doing. And that's pretty exciting to follow.
David, I assume that you're probably along the same lines. What's that like when you see a student's light bulb go on and they all of a sudden get it?
It's one of the best experiences ever. And, it makes you really glad that you're in that business, because, it's just a good feeling. I mean, I had twin son and daughter, and they're in their mid-30s now. And I remember the day that each of them learned to ride their bike, and that sense of, he's a little kid riding the bike for the first time, and the joy and the excitement on their faces when they could do that. And, more mature graduate students and undergraduate students still get that really childlike excitement when a twig's for them. And that is a great part of being a teacher.
And I assume, Keith, you've probably had that moment as the student, but do you still have those moments every so often now that you're in the quote unquote real world?
Yeah, actually, that I was going to say that even though I'm not a formal educator, I say half my job is talking to folks who are in the industry, who want to be in the industry, or building businesses in the industry. But the other half is talking to new entrants into the industry, and that's actually a very rewarding part of my job, is to be able to sit across the table or across the screen, as times are now, with someone to sort of educate them about renewable energy or decarbonization, or how they can potentially make their business more sustainable. So there's a big education component there too, because you're bringing some people in who don't know anything about the industry, and it's starting to have these conversations from a more simple level up until bringing them into the more complex concepts of the industry. So it is there's a big education component there too, even though I'm in the industry.
Fantastic stuff. Well, that is going to do it probably for the questions that I have. And I know that there have been a few that have popped up on the Q&A. So we'll get to those now. And if you've got a few more, by all means, just start typing away and we'll get to them momentarily. So the first one was actually directed towards Joule, but I can see all three actually weighing in on this at some point down the line. It's the question says, great article and feature in the Globe and Mail, Joule. How do you think that will impact the public's perceptions around oil sands development? And Joule, I know that you answered via the Q&A function as well, but if you could verbalize for those who weren't paying attention to that, what did you say to that question?
Yeah, so first of all, the Globe and Mail covered a research paper that we recently had published on oil sands and tools and methods to assess the greenhouse gas impacts associated with oil sands projects. And the focus of this project was to bring industry into a dialogue about open source tools. So tools that we developed at U of C and at Stanford University that allow us to assess the greenhouse gas footprint of these projects. And it was sort of a confidence building exercise to have industry come along with us to see how we're representing the technologies, if there's ways for us to do that better. And what we found was that the models actually did really well. So within 1 to 2% of the or 1 to 4%, sorry, of the estimates that were made by industry themselves. And then we facilitated a dialogue to assess what the role of new technologies might be. And so this is it was an interaction between government, industry, and academia to get better information into the public domain. And so the Globe and Mail wrote about this piece. And what I was saying is that I really do hope that this works helps to facilitate better dialogue about where we're at with emissions intensity in the oil sands, where we could go with new technologies, and then put that in the context of the options that we have available to us. Which of these should we be supporting with public dollars, incenting companies to invest in it, and those kinds of things. So reduce some of the rhetoric of the spin and the opposing perspectives that aren't grounded in the data. So really trying to bring that data to the public domain.
In full disclosure on this, Joule and I worked together on getting the word out about this study. And so I got to kind of dive a little bit deeper. It was one of the first stories I worked on. I started here back on December 1st. And one of the things that I really took away from it was context is so important in this conversation. It's so easy to paint one side or the other as being the evil one kind of thing. And Keith, you kind of alluded to that as well earlier, is we need to have more contextual conversations. We need to be able to kind of have that whole scale discussion so that everybody kind of understands where we're all at the end of the day, because then we make ourselves better. Wasn't really much of a question, was it? It was more of a statement than anything else. Wow.
I agree.
The next question, actually, we'll move on from that. And it comes in from Mohammed. And Mohammed says, what's the role of environment engineer in industry in a broader sense? Because generally in industry, most of the work, either designing or optimization, monitoring the system, is performed by process engineers. So where do these environmental engineers fit in? Who wants to take that stab at that one?
I can take the first stab, and then maybe people can add to it. I think traditionally there has, a development that the environmental engineers sort of get attached to the health and safety department within a company, and this goes beyond energy companies. So oftentimes you'd find them sitting alongside the safety focused engineering and reporting, and a lot of that had to do with satisfying government regulations for reporting information about environmental impacts and things like that. What I've seen over the last decade or so is that there's been a transition to have environmental engineers play a larger role in the strategy side of companies. So actually, instead of just reacting to policy and satisfying regulations, they're actually getting involved in where should this company move in the next 5 years, given that there might be new regulations that would push you in a certain direction, as well as risks to your operation. And now more and more people are looking at what is the carbon footprint of this company? Should we invest in you versus something else? And I think the environmental engineers can really play a role in helping inform that discussion about strategy.
David or Keith, you want to weigh in on that one as well?
Sure. Yeah. Actually, I think I'd like to build a bit on that too. I think companies who have sustainability targets are doing so for a number of reasons, but a couple of the main ones are because they want to, and two, because of policy. And I think there's some new policies being introduced in Canada that we're following really closely, and will impact Alberta, specifically around the clean fuels regulation. And I think what's a role, and I agree with Joule, a role that engineers can play is having the ability to sort of look at that, the policy requirements and where we're seeing the country headed to meet our greenhouse gas emissions targets, but then also having the understanding of the technology and the different sort of adaptive ways that companies could implement different types of technologies to be able to meet those targets. So I agree on the strategy side. I think there's a lot of ways for environmental engineers to participate because of that understanding of the technical side of things. I think environmental engineers in being trained as an environmental engineer, you start getting a bit more of that language that sort of connects the technical side with the environmental and policy side. And I think that's one of the big benefits of having a master's in environmental engineering, is because you're starting to learn the language that kind of connects everything together.
Anything else you'd like to add there, David? He says no, so we'll move on to the we'll move on to the next question. With the new federal climate plan, wouldn't there be a greater demand for environmental engineers, and all the commitments to net zero would put a strain on demand?
Yeah, sure. I could talk about that a little bit. And we're seeing a lot of announcements in policy, and I think specifically around some of the clean fuels stuff and the carbon pricing that was announced last year. I don't think it wasn't a coincidence that was kind of announced just as the U.S. elected in Joe Biden, because I think we're going to see a lot of movement in the U.S. towards more sustainable initiatives and greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So I think Canada's, we're aligning ourselves with our biggest trading partner. So yeah, I definitely think that there's going to be a lot of opportunity in both the, how do you implement technologies to meet some of these climate change targets, and then how do you quantify them, and then specifically in Alberta, there's a big trading mechanism for carbon. So then there's also the monetization of carbon, and there's so many aspects of environmental engineering that fit into all those different types of pieces.
We'll switch gears just a little bit with another question. I want to fire through as many of these as we can. And this one kind of goes along the same lines as what David was talking about a little bit earlier on around sort of the diversification, so to speak, of where environmental engineering can go. And the question is, do the various engineering disciplines have their own culture? And if so, what is the culture of environmental engineering?
That's a good question. I think The old definition of a chemical engineer was someone who taught chemistry in the presence of engineers and engineering in the presence of chemists. I think they do to some extent. I notice it in the students. I think electrical engineering students typically are more physics oriented or mathematics oriented or computing oriented. Mechanical engineering students are the people who tend to build something. But I don't think that's anything more than a sort of rough correlation of personality types. And I think it's starting to break down greatly. I think the increasing number of women that we have in engineering is changing the culture. And that is across the board, even though mechanical engineering typically has the fewest or the lowest percentage of women. And I think it again gets back to what I was saying about cross-disciplinary and transdisciplinary stuff. That in some sense we're merging together rather than going apart.
Do you see that from a private sector perspective, Keith?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I would say that we're definitely growing together, and I think both David and I talked a lot about sort of how multidisciplinary things are, and I think there's a couple different paths that you can choose, because I think you can become the specialist in SCADA systems or something like that, as an electrical engineer. Or you can be more of a generalist, and for me, I'm more of a generalist on the project development side. So being able to talk the language and sort of come together, like David suggested.
Joule, have you seen a change in dynamics around cultures, or has it been fairly progressive since you've gotten involved?
No, I definitely see the progression and the blurring of the lines. When I teach my first year engineering class, the students always ask, why do I need to understand chemical engineering? I want to be a software engineer, right? And then when you go out into industry and you talk to people, they'll say, I was trained as a mechanical engineer and now I do something that's civil related, or vice versa. And that you see the progression of people's careers. And most people that are trained in a particular discipline of engineering, very rarely do they actually stay isolated within just that domain throughout their career. And so I think recognizing that early and then developing some skills that allow you to be a little bit more agile when you get out into the workforce actually can help you.
I like this next question, and I'll pose it to all three of you. We'll start with Keith on this. Is how would you suggest a person decide where to take their environmental engineering career? Because there are so many options. Everybody kind of wonders, how do I find what I love? What would you recommend to them?
Yeah, I mean, that's the $1 million question for everybody, I think, is where do you go? What are you passionate about? I mean, I think that's what's really amazing about environmental engineering, is that there are so many different paths to take. You're talking about sustainability, you're talking about air, water, land, electricity, energy efficiency. I mean, there's just so many, and I think that's why it's so exciting, because everyone's kind of talking about it, and it touches anybody who's doing any sort of engineering. Yeah, as to advice on how to decide, I guess you just got to figure out what really drives you. Do you want to be on the industrial side? Do you want to be on the policy side? Do you want to be on the business side? Because I think engineers fit very well into all those different aspects. Or is there a specific technology that you really love? Like in my case, I really loved electricity and wind power. So that sort of led me in the direction of working in that sector.
I'm sure for both, and I'm sure both Joule and David have faced that question from students time and time again. So what is your advice to students who come up to you and say, listen, I know I want to get here, but I don't know exactly the career trajectory I want to take?
My advice is that often we have more ability to be aware and make decisions on what the opportunities are, rather than setting those opportunities yourself. I mean, if you want to be an entrepreneur in renewable energy, for example, it's often a long, hard slog to get your company up and running, but that is something that you can initiate yourself. But in many situations, the best we can do is take the best of the opportunities that are available to us, and to be very aware of what those opportunities are. So I encourage students and other people who ask me that question is just go out and find what jobs there are available. Of those jobs, which ones would you like to do yourself? Which ones are likely to give you the career progression that you want? So I often put it that way to them.
And I feel like this conversation can go full circle by going to Joule, because Joule, you managed to change career trajectories and weren't afraid of doing so. So I assume that might be part of what the advice is that you give to students is, hey, you know what? If you don't like it after a couple of years, what's stopping you from going in another direction?
Yeah, but I wouldn't say that I wasn't afraid. I just did it anyway, right? And so I think that my advice would be stay open to the possibilities, because often you sort of have this destination in mind and you say no to a bunch of things without actually reflecting on it and taking advantage of the opportunity. And for me, in making these decisions, I also really reflect on where do my passions and my skills and my strengths collide, because you really want to make sure that you're matching those well, and following the passions, but also making sure that you have the skills to go along with that to be able to be successful in that space. And if you do that and stay open, hopefully the opportunities present themselves.
Well, I am mindful of the time. We've gone a full hour, so I want to leave it at that. I want to thank all of our panelists, Keith, Joule, and David, for joining us. I also want to thank Dr. Mohammed for joining us at the beginning of this session. I want to thank all of you as well for joining us for this session. Hopefully you found it intriguing. By all means, we have all the information up on the Schulich website, schulich.ucalgary.ca, for more information on this. And by all means, reach out to anybody on this panel, as I'm sure they've got a wealth of knowledge that they can pass along. At that, we will leave it there. Thank you again so much for joining us here for this session.